This is to whomever would like to answer it. What kinds of credible events could result in an extended station blackout at either of our two local nuclear power plants, Seabrook or Pilgrim? What measures are in place to respond to station blackouts?
I'll start. Things like, the grid can go out to a number of reasons. We've lost the Northeast grid in August of 2003 because a tree branch came into contact with a power line. It caused a large portion of the Northeast and Canada to lose power, affected a number of nuclear power plants. In June of 1998, a tornado struck the Davis-Besse plant outside of Toledo, Ohio, just crumbled up the transmission towers, destroyed the lines. The emergency diesel generators at that plant started and were doing the job, but they failed 26 hours later because it was June of 1998. The outside air temperature was 90+ degrees.
Yeah.
When you run a big engine in a room with bad ventilation, it overheats, and they proved that once again. It's not worked yet. So the diesel generators fried 26 hours later, but fortunately they were able to string a temporary power line back 25 hours later, so they had 1 hour overlap between the power they restored and the diesel generators instead of the other way around. Most of the scenarios are you have some usually severe weather act that knocks out the electrical grid, and then the diesel generators fail. We've had diesel generators fail because they all share a common fuel tank, and we've had water inadvertently put into the fuel tanks, and water and fuel don't mix real well. We've had biological growth in the fuel tanks that's damaged the oil. We've had, Arnie mentioned the service water. Plants in the Midwest, Byron had its service water piping fail. The Wolf Creek plant in Kansas had ice on the lake freeze up, collect against the intake structure that supplied the water to the service water pumps. It was an ice dam, basically, that kept the water on the wrong side of the safety systems. So we've had a number of near misses in where that plant didn't have a loss of electrical grid, but did have failure of the diesels. We've not yet had the combination where we lose the electrical grid and have the diesel generators fail. But the more times each of those wheels comes up bad, the more likely that they'll both come up bad at the same time and causes the American Fukushima.
In 1966, the great Northeast power failure caused by a relay failure. We were out for 2 days.
The nightmare scenario is something called the Carrington effect, which is a solar flare large enough to knock down the grid in the country. And it would damage transformers around the country, and it would be about 10 years before the grid could recover. That would obviously take away the off-site power. The nuclear plants, assuming their diesels ran, could run for about a week until they needed more fuel. And then the question is, where would you get the fuel from if the grid is down and the refineries have stopped? The NRC has been approached by some citizens in either Massachusetts or Maine on that very topic, and Congress has held hearings, and I don't think they're making much progress on that. It happens about once every 150 years, so we don't worry about it.
I think the 100-year floods. And this, again, this is addressed to Dave, actually. How can the public get dry cask storage made mandatory?
I was hoping you'd tell me. The reason I'm at UCS is a spent fuel pool issue that I identified when working at the Susquehanna plant many years ago. So I've been trying the better part, or the worst part of 2 decades to try to get that fixed. We've tried a number of things. We thought 9/11 would push it over the line, and it wasn't. What we're hoping now, kind of like Charlie Brown in the football, I'll keep trying, is there's a Presidential Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Energy Future that's due to release a report in mid-July. We have reason to believe that they're going to address the spent fuel pool storage issue, particularly after Fukushima. The big issue seems to be how to do it without having the utilities pay for it. If it's free, they might do it. So there's looked at various ways of providing the funding so we can fix this safety hazard before it causes problems. As far as how the citizens do it, just raise concerns with congressmen, make sure it gets into remedial law, because at some point it becomes so annoying they'll fix the problem just to make that stop. So the more we annoy them, the more likely we are to make them fix this problem.
Thank you. Which reminds me to remind you, this is not a closing comment, but just reminded me to remind you to pick up the green paper on action and conservation things before you leave. Dr. Clapp, have you seen the report that infant mortality rates are up 35% in selected Northwest U.S. cities post-Fukushima? Does this seem substantiated to you? And does it belie government official claims of no health concerns for U.S. residents in post-Fukushima?
I haven't seen the report. I've seen the press release about the report. And in a statement, the author said that they looked at, I think this is right, CDC reporting from Northwest states, Pacific Northwest states, and in that he included Pasadena, California. So I think there's an error in it, or at least if that's accurate, that report I think has an error in it. And I would need to see the whole report to know more about that. The other thing I would say is that we looked at infant mortality around Pilgrim, around the Plymouth area, the 7 towns, and it actually did go up. In the early 1970s, it was actually 1975 when it started to go up, and the significant releases were 74. So for me, at this point, again, knowing what I know so far, is that it seems like this is a premature claim that the specific Northwest states or counties have already seen a Fukushima-related spike in infant deaths. I think it's strains credibility. I think it's too early to say.
Can I ask you a question myself about the Pilgrim statistics? What forms did these infant mortalities take? Was there an immediate cause? Was it SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, or was there?
Yeah, this is Alice Stewart raised this question about Massachusetts, actually. Alice Stewart's this British deceased heroine physician who studied radiation and leukemia in children, one of the things. And I think actually her thought was not so much SIDS, but these kids were dying in year 1 from leukemia, but it wasn't being called that. And in the state report, I used to work at the state health department, the infant mortality just means death within actually day 28 of 1 year of life. Prior to the 28 previous days, it's called neonatal mortality. So there's this very specific set of criteria for reporting that, and it is really basically just as a death. It doesn't go into detail about whether the child also had leukemia or SIDS. I think SIDS reporting might be more complete now, but there was no answer to the question in 1975 at least.
Thank you.
I have to say one thing. I was doing a paper that I hoped to have peer reviewed, that I was going to look at the releases from these reactors in the 70s. The NRC's public document room has lost those records.
Oh, surprise.
Like I said, we could run screaming from this room. It just gets worse and worse.
Logic would dictate that we do. To either Arnie or Dave, do you think the concrete degradation problems at Seabrook, assuming they continue to worsen, would be likely to derail the relicensing process?
I think the concrete problems are very severe. The NRC is taking them very seriously. I was at an industry conference in February this year that DOE and NRC sponsored about license renewal, extending life even beyond 60. Turned out that was age, not IQ. But the NRC chairman was asked, as long with every other industry person who spoke, as to what is the Achilles heel? What is the thing that will stop license renewal? When does it stop? In every answer, every person answered that it was concrete. That was the limiting factor. Some of the other things could be dealt with, but concrete is such a large problem that you cannot replace a building economically. You could go to that. So I sat at that conference wondering why person after person was saying that, because I'm not really a big concrete person, but when you see the Seabrook report and how serious the NRC is taking it, that may be, they may rue the day they went in for early license renewal because they may lead to early shutdown.
Yes.
And then, they're not the only reactor. Salem has had problems with it. You know, it seems seems like especially those on the coast, because anybody who's ever been in a parking garage in the Northeast who realizes the salt that drips off their cars craps up the parking garage, that same thing is happening in nuclear plants, but through salt water intrusion from below. And so the Seabrook plant is not alone in that problem.
Look at the bridges in the Northeast.
Would you agree to gray area?
Say?
Concrete.
Dear.
Thanks, Ray.
Yeah. This is not addressed to anyone in particular. The half-life of the spent fuel is so ridiculously long. Can we ever safely store it? Is there any hope of neutralizing that waste in the future?
No.
I think
no.
let me throw something into it. There's a famous book called The New Species of Trouble, and it's by a sociologist, actually, named Kai Erickson, and he talks about this. How do you do a risk assessment on something that's going to be 20,000 years before it's safe to even come close to it? There's no meaningful way to do that. So I think the answer is, there's no safe way to do this.
And the movie that Dave mentioned also answers all those questions.
Give the name of that again, please.
Into eternity.
Into eternity. I mean, that is eternity for us mortals, isn't it? This is a long, multi-part question, but it seems important. This is for Dave. Regarding your report, the NRC and nuclear power plant safety in 2010, a brighter spotlight needed. Multi-part question. Given a recurring theme that workers fail to evaluate problems on a more than cursory level, and given that human error is often a contributing factor to events, and given that other reports disclose that 87% of workers at Fukushima were subcontractors, can you provide at least a broad figure on an industry-wide basis as to how much responsibility is delegated to subcontractors at U.S. plants, and what responsibility the NRC has to ensure their qualifications?
The percentage of work done by subcontractors is somewhere in the ballpark of about 20%, 20 to 25% at U.S. reactors. Most of that work is done during refueling outages when plants bring in truckloads of workers to do a lot of work in a short period of time, so they farm that out to subcontractors. The NRC tries to ensure that companies use subcontractors to ensure that they're high-quality work. That doesn't always lead to successful outcomes. What we would like to see happen, whether it's done by normal permanent workers or subcontractors, is that when mistakes are made, the NRC should require owners to figure out why that happened, why that wasn't found in testing after work was done, why did the failure occur, why wasn't, you do a lot of testing and inspections, why didn't they find those problems? Some companies have a very successful program of managing that work and protecting against those bad outcomes. They say it's for public safety, but they have $1 billion asset that they'd assume not become $1 billion liability in a few minutes.
Right.
So they try to do it right. Those that don't get the message or aren't successful at that, we would want the NRC to sanction them when it doesn't work right and get them to follow the example of the companies that are doing it the right way for all of our goods.
Can I add one more thing to that? Again, in this epidemiologic feasibility study, we were looking at populations that we might study to see whether they had an effect of low-dose exposure. One of the groups was the refueling workers. I think the nickname is jumpers, who work for these companies that actually go from one plant to the next. And we found that they don't have very good records. In fact, some people who work as temporary workers in these refueling operations change their names to the next job so that they don't have a record that says that that badge was, that they had exceeded their annual limit. So we don't even know how to keep track of the right person. So again, the problem with temporary workers is real. I think it actually might be a higher percentage in some other countries, but it's certainly a real exposure problem.